finance is really an enabler, and it can be an enabler of climate change. It can be an enabler of inequality, but it can also be an enabler of sustainability. It can also be an enabler of development. It can also be an enabler of the societies that we want to see and want to create. And part of that is figuring out how to work with the real economy and how to work with people in different countries and communities to both identify what their needs are, but also create the right policies and incentives to really think about this in a way that enables finance to play the constructive role. And I think from my standpoint, it's figuring out the way that finance, almost like a flowing river, plays that role of feeding the places that need to have that necessary irrigation and need to continue to grow, and turning off those channels that are flowing into the destructive and potentially disruptive areas.
We are on an adventure to unite the stories and solutions of the pioneers, creating a better future for all. Together, we will journey to every continent, every country and community, and ask the question, what is the future you dream of? We will explore the blockers to us getting there, and we will ask, what will it take? What do we need? What do you need to create a future where we all thrive in balance and harmony with nature and each other? In this episode, we adventure with David Carlin, Head of Climate Risk and TCFD for the UN Environment Programme's Finance Initiative. Together, we will explore how we need to consider and welcome people from all over the world and all types of economic backgrounds to receive the benefits from a just transition in a way that feels equitable. We will discuss finance, clean energy finance, universal basic income, and the sharing of wealth, how we need to be creative, interdisciplinary, intersectional, and intergenerational in our thinking and acting, and that the financial instruments we need for our future may not be the ones that we are currently using. That's not all. We'll also explore the challenge that is a lack of funding options that are outside the ones that feel like they give a commercial return. I think it's a massive gap there. And we'll look at the difference between acting on climate and reducing carbon and the complexities of nature and ecosystems. We have a little bit of a look at carbon pricing and Europe's proposed carbon border adjustment and the challenges of reporting and what reporting ideally should be. Many of you will know that that's a massive challenge, reporting, and definitely needs simplifying and for us to spend a lot less time on it. So you can read action takeaways from this episode, comment, co-create future episodes, and connect with fellow changemakers in the Future Planet community of action by visiting futureplanet.love to sign in or sign up. Let's get into it. So it's such a pleasure today to welcome David Carlin. He's the founder of Cambium. Is that Cambium Global Solutions? Is that the right way to say it?
Yep, that's correct.
Nice, nailing this intro already. He's an advisor to governments, corporates, and financial institutions on climate and sustainability. He's also head of Climate Risk and TCFD for the UN Environment Programme's Finance Initiative, UNEP FI, and he has authored numerous reports that provide practical tools and guidance to firms looking to thrive in a changing world. I am super excited to dive into this very important part of how we might approach solving this from a systems perspective. So we have some great questions. We have some great topics. We'll be talking about, I would imagine, carbon pricing, deforestation, how to move the finance industry further forward. And I'd love to look at I saw a stat recently that you shared around just 5% of European companies are aligned with a 1.5 degree trajectory and have a transition plan. So there are some really interesting things there. And I'm sure that you've got some great areas for us to explore as well. But I think let's start with a nice, who are you and what's, introduction to yourself and also your purposeful work as well. Could you share a little bit about that? That's that part of your world?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think you gave a really good overview of my current work, but to give a bit of background, I had been a liberal arts student. I had really thought about going into academia in this area of how people make decisions, so behavioral economics. And I wasn't quite sold on doing that yet. So I first tried to work with people that had advanced degrees in economics, in quantitative fields. That got me into the risk space, which was really hot after the financial crisis. I moved into consulting, but also realized that I had this whole other part of me outside of professional work that was very much active, which was around both activism for educational equity, economic empowerment, but also I realized that the sense of community that I felt volunteering and working with people was really something that I wanted to capture. And so I started a nonprofit called The Active Citizen in New York. So while I was working as a consultant, I ended up doing a number of programs and events to bring young people together to look at different social causes in New York and to actually get their hands dirty in the field, working with organizations, sharing their skills. And I think it was a little bit the confluence of those circumstances, both the interests I was doing outside of work, as well as that risk background that led me to this secondment initially with the UN, where I was coming in to help them explore what were the financial implications of climate and climate risks. And from there, I sort of really found something that was, to me, the perfect synthesis of all these things that I had wondered about, both the kind of research and academic, the integrated systems thinking, the element of action and activism, and the professional skills that I'd been cultivating over the decade of my career. So climate became that umbrella, and especially at that intersection of climate and finance, a real opportunity to explore something. So that's how I came to head the program at the United Nations. And from there realized that there was a lot of interest in this space. So I've been kind of branching out from there just based on demand of people that I've gotten to meet.
I love it. And I'm so grateful that that's how you started. I'd read that about you, and I felt my heart open when I noticed your journey. And so I feel very grateful that someone with your perspective and the way that you feel and see the world is in a world that typically perhaps hasn't always had that perspective, or one of the major challenges that we face is a massive level of inequality, for example, or there's some real challenges we have in the capitalist financial system where I feel super happy that you're there figuring it out with people, with smart people. So that feels great. And so what's the focus of your purposeful work in that space? Like, what's around you? What are you working on? What are some of the things that you see there?
Yeah, I like to think of myself as being a connector first. And we often talk about in this sort of lofty term with the UN of the convening power of the UN, which gives the illusion of this sort of big organization. But what I really found as an individual is that much of that connection is not even organizational, but interpersonal. And so one of the things that I've really enjoyed has been seeing what different organizations are doing and either bringing them into my program for financial institutions to share perspectives from, say, climate modelers, from standard setters, bringing perspectives of what those who are working at the local level are seeing as viable climate solutions. And so, one, I think it informs how you think in a broader context. But two, I think that the work that I do is trying to join up the dots. I think understanding both what we're doing on climate, but also how it relates to all of these other important issues. I know a lot of people have gotten kind of this framework fatigue. Okay, we looked at climate risks. Now we're looking at nature risks. Now we also have to consider social effects and impacts and the just transition. But unfortunately, I tell people, none of these are optional, but fortunately, each of them is self-reinforcing. And so to me, I kind of see stepping back and trying to find the pieces of information and communicate those, sometimes as a knowledge creator myself, but often as a communicator of what is science saying, of what are the big trends, what are the ways that people can take these things and use them within their organizations.
Yeah. Everything's very interconnected, isn't it? And I love exploring that from a systemic perspective, and actually it's not simple, but it becomes simple when we have that view of it. And yeah, I also, something that really resonates with me is a lot of this is about the right people in the right rooms sharing in an authentic, open, sort of heart-centered way about, oh, we're working on this, or we're doing this, or, and another thing that really speaks to me is that sort of building of collective knowledge and sharing it in a way that people can receive. And one of the big challenges that I find is that it's just that people are time poor. There is so much information and there are so many different channels fighting for our attention. So that role of like really connecting with people and helping them to receive key insight, because the role of a sustainability or finance professional is complex and challenging and has an increasing number of demands on what they need to be thinking about, even just in, as you mentioned, climate, nature, and people, right? That becomes really large, especially if you've got a team of 2 or 3 or perhaps even just 1. Maybe you've got slightly more, but often it's small teams. So yeah, the way that we connect and share knowledge feels so integral. So you're working within a system. What would be what are we aiming for? Like, what's your vision of that future? Like, how does that system, or how does that part of our society or our world, how does that look like if it's functioning in a future where we can all thrive in balance and harmony with nature? Like, what is that like? What are we aiming for?
Yeah, so speaking specifically to the financial system, and that's the area where I'm most closely working. Finance is really an enabler, and it can be an enabler of climate change. It can be an enabler of inequality, but it can also be an enabler of sustainability. It can also be an enabler of development. It can also be an enabler of the societies that we want to see and want to create. And part of that is figuring out how to work with the real economy and how to work with people in different countries and communities to both identify what their needs are, but also create the right policies and incentives to really think about this in a way that enables finance to play the constructive role it should. And one of the things that I think I've realized working in the environmental space is how powerful the analogy of an ecosystem is, that it's very hard to think about actors or even bilateral relationships as being representative of the whole picture. It really is not that food chain, but that food web. It's really that each actor, whether it's governments creating policies, real economy innovators developing new technologies, social activists advocating for indigenous communities, each of them plays a role that you can't simply sub out or remove. And I think from my standpoint, it's figuring out the way that finance, almost like a flowing river, plays that role of feeding the places that need to have that necessary irrigation and need to continue to grow, and turning off those channels that are flowing into the destructive and potentially disruptive areas.
I love your use of language when you say that. I read a post that you wrote recently where you said $6.1 trillion in financing went to companies most at risk of driving deforestation. And I guess that what you're talking about there is one of those taps that we need to turn off. Could you speak a little bit to that?
Yeah, so that was from a really great report called Forest 500 from Global Canopy, which does a lot of work in the broader nature and ecosystem space. But this report particularly is about deforestation. And I think the things that really came to light for me there were not necessarily just that funding is going to companies that potentially are actively or inadvertently supporting deforestation, but really how porous the overall commitment landscape is. Back at COP26 in Glasgow, we saw over 130 nations commit to anti-deforestation pledges. And yet, while this is something that in certain instances is well flagged among financial institutions, okay, we don't want to contribute to the destruction of rainforest in this place through the production of palm oil, or, oh, we want to make sure that we're not contributing here. The systematic elements of it are not necessarily there. And as a result, because, as I've used this analogy of finance being like a liquid, flows go where there are openings. And as long as you keep those holes in the policies, as long as you keep those practices relatively lax, finance will flow. And in fact, by turning off the tap in certain places, you may increase the pressure in others. And so it's not only essential to think about what individual companies are doing, but on a systemic basis to really identify what needs to be done to raise that floor, to raise that base level, to say this is something that can't happen, not just in specific instances, but can't happen anywhere if we want to really be avoiding the consequences of deforestation.
Yeah, it was a really interesting list. And I think I'd love to get into what some of those holes are. So let's hold that thought. But just my reflection on that list was, one of the things was that the most visible companies that we can see, Unilever and Nestle, were performing the best up at the top of that list. They had some way to go, but clearly they were. And then if you search it and look at the very bottom of the list, there's a load of companies that we've never heard of that are below the parapet. Maybe we've not just heard of in this country, but there feels like this huge group of organizations and companies that are almost perhaps sometimes hidden from public scrutiny and therefore don't receive so much. Oh, what about this? Why is this happening? And that was one thing that I felt was interesting there, like a lack of access to knowledge and almost sort of this desire for it to be simple and easy to point fingers at the things we could see rather than the things we can't see. When the things we can't see felt like so much more in need of governance, perhaps, or best practice. Are there other? So you can speak to that, but also are there other holes that you can see that would be good to close?
Yeah, so I think that maybe answering both those questions at once, this idea, I would almost call it the iceberg effect, that, and perhaps apropos with climate change, but what we see and what is visible is often just a small portion of the overall industry or the overall practice. And keeping up pressure on those companies is essential. It's why these standards have developed and have advanced at those places, why systematic policies and processes are in place. So these big companies actually often have dedicated staff looking at individual deals, looking at individual communities where they operate. Once you go down, though, you realize that a lot of the activity in a distributed market doesn't occur just from the big players. And so while that scrutiny, I wouldn't say is misplaced, I would say that it needs to extend deeper. And I think paradoxically, on one of the big areas of holes, it actually relates to fossil fuels and fossil fuel financing, which is to say, we always think about the BPs, the Exxons, the Chevrons of the world. And certainly there's a long record of whether obfuscation of the climate science, lobbying efforts, and ongoing production of fossil fuels that these companies have played a contributing role to the climate crisis. There is nowadays a massive amount of hydrocarbon reserves, meaning natural gas as well as oil, that are held in the hands of state-owned entities. And those entities often are not going to be subject to the whims of the market or the wills and campaigns of activists. And so it's not to say that we're looking in the wrong places, but I think we do need to consider what lies below the surface and to have approaches to it, because there's not much benefit in pushing into the unaccountable what we would like to account for. I think the goal is not to push it down, but to bring out these practices. And so to really show, to lower that water level, to see really what is beneath, what is happening in small and medium-sized businesses, what is happening in state-owned companies. These are the places where ultimately the effects will go. And so I think it's not to say we shouldn't spend time thinking about what big campaigns can focus on the biggest companies, because they are market leaders. But it isn't enough to say that our work is done, when they are named and shamed.
My opinion, but also where I found connection and strength, has been that actually these organizations are made up of individuals, and there are often passionate individuals in these organizations that need support to change or to help them to change, or it could be within a country or whatever, a city or a community. And actually, if you're talking about intentional connection, the role that we collectively have is building those interconnected networks and providing support and strength to those people that are trying to close those holes in what we might perceive as being like against, but actually there are many people that are for, that really care about transforming that system, and that it's about supporting them as much as anything else. And I think, I can't see a world where it works if we're against everyone. I think it definitely, I definitely didn't, I'm not saying that you said that, I think building on what you're sharing, I think it feels about building togetherness and connection and support for as many people as we can find in those areas and in those organizations. And then, what
you're saying really resonates with me. And I think it's about thinking of institutions not as these monolithic and corporeal entities, despite what the U.S. Supreme Court might say about the free speech of corporations. But really, these are collections of individuals. And I think about the work I do at the UN, and I think about the individual work that I do supporting organizations and governments as really empowering those people that are at the point of the spear, the people that are working within the organization to drive change. And they are on the inside, I am on the outside for their organization. And so if they have the tools, if they are better equipped, they're going to be in the best position. And so I think it's important to be clear-eyed and not consider engagement with people to be tantamount to giving carte blanche to the actions and activities of the companies and organizations that they represent. But I do think it means working from within, and I do think it means giving those people who do want to make the change the tools they can, because I always say it's easier from the inside than from the outside. And so if we have people on the inside, which we do, we should be working with them and giving them the tools that they need to be successful.
That feels really true to me as well. What are some of the other blockers to us getting to that point where the river of finance flows in a way that grows the future that we all would love versus at the moment? Like what are some of the other blockers you can see, and how might we unlock them?
Yeah, so I would maybe point to three different ones that are most current and most relevant as we go through this new year. And the first is on the governmental or development finance side. And this is really, how do we unlock development finance? How do we provide financing for countries both most impacted by climate change as well as those that are currently developing and need to choose a different course rather than fossil fuel development? How do you ensure standards of living? And so really seeing development and climate being intertwined and not oppositional, not seeing we can protect the environment or we can improve welfare, but rather what are solutions and where does finance go? And that's really development finance. That's looking at organizations like the World Bank. It's thinking about the idea of how do we also avoid leaving countries maybe that are financially in tight straits, but have lots of other valuable natural resources. How do we allow them to begin to claim those? And this is where things like debt for nature swaps, where elements of restructuring to protect and preserve elements of the natural environment are so important. So I think a reimagining and a rethinking of that, and I would point listeners to the work of the Bridgetown initiative, thinking about what work we can do to really reimagine how development finance changes. I think that's step one, is unlocking that in a way that enables countries to adapt, enables them to make progress, and avoids trapping them in debt. So I know there are a couple more, but I think that's a fairly meaty one. So maybe we'll start on that, and then we can talk about the private sector.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you. So, and I think in the UK, we've been through a few changes of our government departments that look at climate. For example, we had DEC, then it was absorbed into BEIS, and then now it's moving to another form. And I have felt for some time actually that an aligned policy in terms of like how governments are operating and acting in other countries through the world, hopefully for better, but unfortunately sometimes often for worse. Like that feels like it's how we align the governance or the governments of our countries, and how that feels such an integral part to unlocking what you're sharing there. Does that resonate? And do you see anyone doing that well yet?
So I think that this is one of the areas that needs a lot more attention. A lot of that focus has been on multilateral finance, like the World Bank. But I would say we have both in the UK, in the US, and in Europe, a lot of these big deals around decarbonization, and not quite enough focus on what does that mean outside of our borders, and how do we as leaders try to support decarbonization and sustainable development in other places. I think we need to really have not only a reimagining of development finance, but also a reimagining of of national and international interest to say we can't think of this simply as ODA, overseas development aid. We have to really be thinking about this as a way that we can jointly achieve our climate goals, and that there's a benefit in both being a leader, but also in taking the steps that are necessary to progress here on helping other countries leapfrog over some of the fossil fuel development that has so characterized the West.
That feels true. I think we have yet to, with empathy and listening, and we've yet to cross from a space where there's so much divide, I think, in this area. And even if we just think about the last 20 years, predominantly the key activating elements of, I don't even want to say Western countries, but some countries has been fighting or preserving of reserves, or making sure they can grab land or resources or power or something like that. And that's fundamentally wrong. And then if we look at the way that many governments are approaching this sort of we're in this together, what should be we're in this together, and is also, there sort of feels like a protectionism there, like a sort of, so it's like we want to grab power or we want to grab resources, but if it becomes to extending support, then we're going to hold back and protect. And I feel like that way of governance or that way of government doesn't feel like it exists in this world that we're talking about. Like, I don't think you could operate it in that world. It feels we still have to make that journey, I think, to a better space around that.
I think that's absolutely right. That's one of the big problems that we see is this is a 20th century, if not, to be totally frank, a 19th century mentality of national interest that is being grafted onto a 21st century problem. And we have much different borders, we have much different flows of goods, people, and capital than ever before. And it's really incumbent upon us to see solutions that are win-win-win and not ones that are narrowly defined. And I think in some cases it is partisanship. In other cases, it is various other special interests that create those disincentives to think in that way. But fundamentally, it is going to be the big challenge here, is each country trying to pull themselves along individually will never move as fast as countries working together. And that's been a realization when it's come to global trade. I think it needs to now be one when it comes to global collaboration on climate.
Yeah, that feels really true. That feels like there's a lot of deep work to be done there to make that transition.
Yeah, if we could just wave a wand and then we'll be there, that would be a good wish for 2023, wouldn't it?
Yeah. We can be intentional about bringing that in, and I would welcome people that work in those spaces to explore how to be intentional at opening their hearts. And So, what are the other two big blockers?
So I think the second one really is around private finance and getting private finance to flow not only at the levels needed, but to the places needed to support a transition to a sustainable and just future. And that is something that the International Energy Agency, organizations like Bloomberg New Energy Finance, those that really look at the energy system and draw out the pathways of how we get to this decarbonized future, have talked about needing to scale up financing by either 3 to 6 times by 2030 compared to current levels. We've just cracked $1 trillion in clean energy investments. If we look at the incomplete data for 2022, but we really need that to grow rapidly. But now the question and the added challenge is not just how does that grow, and some of that will be from public finance, but a lot of that is private finance, and much of that private finance occurs in the West, in industrialized countries. And yet most of the global emissions that we know, most of the vulnerable people that will need to adapt are going to be in other parts of the world. So if we have finance that will get the US to net zero, if we have finance that will get the UK to net zero, does that solve our problem? And I think the short answer in a shared atmosphere and a shared environment is it doesn't. And so really thinking about unlocking private finance, not only on the scale, but in the places that are necessary. And that, as I said, is getting back to that point of leapfrogging, so perhaps blended finance between development finance and the private sector, but also funding for adaptation and funding also for the expansion and deployment of renewable technologies in countries like India, in countries around sub-Saharan Africa, that are going to be the main drivers of both new population growth in the world, but also the ones that are going to likely see the greatest growth economically over the next 3 decades.
It feels important to, obviously this is a linear view of it. So it's to say that we should benefit from the financing of a just transition. Sometimes you can't look at that in that way. But if you were to look at it, for example, if there is investment to be made and there are returns to be made from this transition, then it feels like if we're talking about terms like universal basic income and sharing wealth, that we also need to be considering how we can welcome people from all over the world and all types of economic backgrounds to share in that future and receive the benefits from that transition in a way that feels equitable and not like a handout, but like something where they participated, where they played a role, and where they received from that. I think that feels for me instinctive. And I what I see happening at the moment is a lot of money going into VCs and that sort of style of financing. And there's probably other money going into other spaces as well. I'm not saying there isn't, but actually that's a fairly that system doesn't work for everyone. Like it works for a few people and the solution will get funded and scaled, but the returns don't go to everyone for that. And there's something there I think that would be interesting to unlock if we're looking about really sharing true value with people as well.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And with the VC model, I think it's mistaking the fact that there are different life cycles of innovation and company development, mistaking a particular stage in that life cycle and a specific means of supporting that stage as the only way to do it. And I think it's a very narrow look at how to drive innovation. It's a very narrow look at how to scale early stage companies. But whether it's through support of governments, whether it's through incentives, there's so many other moving pieces, getting back to that ecosystems analogy. And I think considering VC and the distribution of benefits, mostly to the partners and principals within the firms, as well as to the founders who tend to be white, male, and Western for the most part, then I think you are looking at a more limited solution. And again, it's not to say that there isn't a lot of positive that can come out of it, but I think the mistake is thinking it's the only channel through which that scale can happen. So the last point actually was going to be very similar to what you've just mentioned, which is this question of equality and just saying, tying back to these first two.
Yeah, great. Can we just expand a little bit on the financing bit? Yeah, nice. I agree. And I think one of the challenges there is the lack of funding options that are outside of the ones that feel like they give a commercial return. And I think there's a massive gap there in the allocation of resources and finance across the board towards both early stage and systemic solutions. And there's a lot of money going into it. There's programmatic funders. And in the last 2 to 5 years, I think a significant amount of money has gone into it. But there is a big gap in the necessary funding. And there is a big gap in collaborative funding, so to benefit all. So for example, if you've got funding from a VC and a corporate partnership and also perhaps a philanthropy type organization, maybe you would have a more interesting mix of outputs. And what I love the work that Considered Capital are doing in the UK around helping founders find alternative forms of finance, for example, like what other systems and models. And I think that for me feels like we've seen a growth in VC funding. And I think we've obviously seen a growth in, for example, government funding, but there is a big opportunity and big space for more funding in more different types of ways, for more solutions at different stages of where they're progressing, and definitely more joined upness. Like I see a big gap in the amount of joined upness and connected dots. I think there's intention there, but I think there could be so much more done, so much more coordination done, and in some ways simplification. Like a lot of the things that I see through the community that we hold space for is there's a need for funding things that like don't have a budget line, but would be really important. or like you couldn't say, oh, this is going to give us a return, or it's going to have X amount of impact for these people's lives, but it's a thing that's needed and it's a thing that's not there. And sometimes, quite strangely, that could just be, we need to get these 10 people in a room and have a dialogue with them for like 3 sessions so we can get to a point where we feel like that. Or it could be, how do we help the right number of people receive this level of information on these particular key topics? And so it's not just the funding for solutions that I see as a gap. It's a funding for solutions that we don't consider to be sort of a scalable thing as a gap as well, even if they would unlock change. Yeah. Thank you for letting me share that. Appreciate it.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right, and gets to that idea both that we need to be creative, we need to be interdisciplinary in our thinking, but we also need to recognize that not everything will fit super well into traditional financial boxes. And this is why the role of governments are so important, because when we think about the ideas economists talk about public goods and the value of things that everyone can benefit from, but maybe don't necessarily have a direct return to one single person, those things will be underprovided in societies where there isn't some market intervention by governments, whether it's to provide a social safety net, whether it's to build a public park. And similarly, climate has quite a lot of those where we're all better off from the infrastructure being built, but perhaps no one individually benefits from a single return on this or that particular climate solution. Obviously, there will be many that are marketable. There will be many. And the issue here, I don't think, is forgetting the market. I think it's working with the market and figuring out the ways to catalyze and enhance that market through the role of government. I also think, though, that societies and consumers themselves have an active role to play in choosing the things that they want to see. We can vote. The old phrase of voting with our pocketbooks is absolutely true in many cases, and it's been the case when it comes to electric vehicles. It's been the case when it's come to meat alternatives, and I think a lot of this is not just what is the immediate return, but also how are market preferences shifting? How are consumers themselves thinking? So I think it's governments, it's the companies and the financial markets themselves, and it's also the consumers.
Yeah. In collaboration with intention, I think is the, and it's been interesting to notice now, and certainly within the business sector, like the step change in attention and desire to collaborate, and looking now at collaboration as being a way that we can move together further forward faster, but also looking at it at collaboration as a way, in a funny kind of way, to reduce competitive advantage. If we're doing it all together, then, and this is a space where it needs to be pre-competitive, right? We're acting on, I think there's a number of areas here that would be. So that's been a big change. Like, I think the desire to collaborate, the desire to share, the desire to join together, and the desire of often the leaders and not first followers, but this kind of second group of organizations thinking, okay, how can we move everyone further forward? And that's been in the last 2 to 5 years, I think. Even maybe in the last year, I've seen like a big change in that. So yeah, you want to talk about equity, which I think is deeply important. Do you feel ready to move now, or do you feel like, yeah?
I think just briefly because I think it's kind of a thread flowing through each of the things that we've talked about, which is to say that we need a transition and we need a future that is going to work for more people than our current system works for. And we need one that's going to be durable and sustainable. And I think a lot of times people have in their mind their own views of a just transition. They may look specifically at workers in high emissions industries that are losing their jobs, that need retraining and shouldn't be forgot about. But we can also talk about countries that have been on the receiving end of extraction from other parts of the world for long periods of time. We can also talk about countries that are looking to reach standards of living similar to those seen in North America and Western Europe. And I think these are all examples of people that need to be involved. This is a multi-stakeholder problem. And I think when we look back at some of the failings that have taken place previously, I think they're ones that have cut out certain stakeholders. Kyoto, for example, was a important landmark in international negotiation, in international climate diplomacy, but at the time completely overlooked China. And by the time Kyoto was actually in force, the emissions from China were so much greater than people had anticipated that now China had to be included. And so had that been done earlier, had there been better considerations, a perhaps more durable and stronger based incentive program for other nations to cut emissions could have been adopted. So I think it's one of the many examples that shows the perils of failing to consider stakeholders. The same thing with the Yellow Vest protests in France, that when we don't think about certain groups, when we don't consult certain groups, I think we run the risk of seeing the overall transition stall, seeing that overall progress face up against retrenchment, and in many cases, some of the darker and more reactionary elements that want to hold back change because people feel threatened, and in some cases, justifiably so.
When any of us act from a position of fear or threat, it feels difficult for us to move forward in the way that we would need to move forward, right? And it's been interesting. I wonder where we're at with that in the way that we convene people at the moment. I see pockets of hands being extended to welcome intersectional, intergenerational, different groups of people to be part of the conversation. It feels like often it's still them and us, even if we're together in the same space. I feel like that definitely feels like that feels true. And I wonder if we will get to the point where our decision making is as inclusive as it needs to be. And do you see areas where that is working well?
So I think in some ways, international mechanisms are a promising way of showing how we can all get around the table. What they haven't really done is deliver a lot of progress, and the fact that we're on our 28th COP this year is a bit of evidence of that, unfortunately. But what I would say is it's the kind of cross-coordinating initiatives, work that's being done by non-governmental organizations, connecting to governments, to local communities, and to the private sector, that I think has shown a really effective operating model. Now the challenge, I think, is figuring out how to do those things at scale. Somebody once said to me, it's really about making climate finance and nature finance boring. That really is the main focus to make this a ordinary and well-integrated part rather than an exceptional part. And I think that really comes from having mechanisms that become part of the general operating model of the global economy rather than these simple, more explicit elements of individual demonstration projects.
And in that embedded within organizations' operational way of running the business, rather than perhaps just within the sustainability or CR team or ESG team, it feels like that's the next step as well, to embed some of these practices, frameworks, and way of approaching business through the whole organization. And certainly we see I see various levels of that having been done, and some leaders having done that well, and some still approaching how that they can get to that point so their whole organization is empowered in that direction. I have some questions, but do you feel like you'd like to share anything else before I move the conversation in a particular direction?
No, I'd love to hear where you're thinking of going, and I feel like we've covered so many interesting areas here, and I definitely love to think about both potential ways to move things forward, but also covering any of the areas you'd like.
Yeah. So I have one tactical thing that just arose out of conversation recently, and I think I'll just remove, we'll talk about it, but I think it's an interesting challenge. The number of reporting frameworks and the requirement to report into those frameworks and to take account of those frameworks is a drain on the resources and time of small teams in often large organizations. And I see that as being a major blocker towards people moving further forward. For example, it might take someone between 1 to 3 months of their year to report on TCFD, SBTI, TNFD, all the different areas that they are needed to do that. What's your experience of that, and how do you think we can overcome that challenge?
Yeah, I think fundamentally it's about really changing how we think about reporting. I think if it is a reporting exercise, one that's done because of a mandate or as something that's additional to show what the firm is doing at a high level because that has become what their peers are doing. I do think that these are additional burdens. These are additional challenges for firms, and I'm not sure how much they really advance things. Ideally, reporting should be reflective of practices that a firm is doing and should bring transparency into the marketplace, which means that people should be using that information. I think we often spend way too much time focused on what does a good report look like rather than what about the contents in that report is good information. I can follow the guidance of accounting standards and let you know my company is going to go out of business. That doesn't necessarily mean we would applaud my financial statements. And so there's a difference between completeness and good practice. And I think we need to fairly rapidly shift from trying to be reporters and also trying to be users of this information as individual firms. I also think that the lack of organizational support can often leave those doing reporting responsibilities on a bit of an island where that report doesn't sync up with strategy, doesn't sync up with operations. And then it does become simply a cost center, simply an additional burden. So I think it really is about a reimagining of this and a dedicating of adequate resources, not to the documentation of it, but to the actual execution. The documentation should be simply a recap of what activities the firm is already doing rather than trying to run new analyses and create things simply to put them in a report.
That feels true. I definitely feel like most teams that I know are under-resourced. And I mean, how could we ever be fully resourced, right? Like we've got so much to do. But I do think that being like the leaders of those organizations, recognizing the importance of resourcing their teams correctly and enabling them to allocate their time on effective action as opposed to data collection and reporting, or bringing people in specifically to help with those kinds of areas, I think would really, really help and would help them move further forward faster towards their goals. If we look at the connection between the finance industry and business, I think that's become slightly more clear in the last year or two. I think CEOs have been saying, what's happening around TCFD? Like, we need to know like what we're doing with this in this particular area, for example. How can we build closer relationships between the finance industry and the business industry, like and between finance industry and business? Like, what are your thoughts on that?
It's really about understanding where capital needs to go from the business perspective, and from the financial perspective, a clear communication on what information is needed from businesses in order to meet their commitments. Finance always has this kind of dual role of we are the ones that drive the global economy through provision of capital, but all we do is finance the global economy, and you kind of can't have the spotlight but also shrink back from it. And part of that means that if you are going to be really trying to set goals as a financial institution, you need information and you need various commitments from those that you're working with and decisions on who you will continue to keep as clients. And then from the individual institutions within the real economy, I think they need to be the ones that are closest to it, communicating where their capital needs are within the transition and where these things may pay off and how they potentially align together. But having two groups making plans in isolation of each other is not going to be a recipe for success.
Yeah, that feels really true. It feels, I really resonate with the togetherness rather than, we think you should do this and we're doing this. It definitely feels like making those decisions together. And then also together across industry, for example, feels like a very productive way to run that. If it's okay with you, I'd love to explore carbon pricing and also think about nature as well within that. How are we doing on carbon pricing and accurately pricing value with regards to nature? Like, are we doing well on that, or are we still sort of figuring that piece out? And where do we need to get to?
So starting with carbon, what I would say is on a day yesterday where the EU's carbon price cracked $100 within their ETS system, their cap and trade market, I would say that progress is being made, but carbon is a very leaky quantity in the sense that if production is happening in places where there are low or no carbon prices, then unless you have strong policies like Europe's proposed carbon border adjustment mechanism, unless you have policies that will make sure that a carbon price is enforced, you're going to just simply see activities take place in other places that will get around it. Is the current carbon price, or what we call the social cost of carbon, the damage that each ton of carbon in the atmosphere does, is that currently being reflected globally? I think the answer is definitively it's not. But at the same time, some of these smaller scale or regional based initiatives, whether it's with a number of US states, whether it's with provinces in Canada or countries in Europe, have shown some promise in delivering some incentives. But those are going to be vastly more effective in the context of this work that is about really getting a global carbon price together rather than simply a series of disconnected regional programs. So that's on carbon, but I would say on nature, we're at a much earlier stage.
I'd love to get into that because we are at a much earlier stage. But also, where would the leadership come from that? Like, how would that, like, even at a country level, you're still looking at people as being perhaps first actors on that. So it's, even then you can imagine if one country figured it out or two countries figured it out, you still got a whole load of other countries that have yet to do that. So at what level is the leadership required to be able to implement that?
So I think because of national sovereignty, these things need to come into effect at a national level, but I do think that they are ones that will be best agreed in an international and multilateral forum, whether it's across the G20, whether it's in discussions through the World Trade Organization, but ultimately it's places where we can create incentives for compliance, even amongst countries that haven't yet adopted rules. So if we say, for example, within my country, anything coming in requires a carbon price of X, that can both avoid the disincentive to move things out of the country, but also creates an incentive for others. So that's I think one of the biggest places, these international discussions, but it does have to happen at a national level. And we can see from the US case how fraught that is, that's still something that the US as a country, a single country, hasn't been able to agree to, which is a national carbon price.
It feels like it would be simpler, but it also gets a lot more complicated when you're representing multiple interests at a country or global level. So actually, I can't see that unlocking itself quickly or easily, actually.
No, and this is why it's the economist's favorite solution, because on paper, a carbon price would very simply and elegantly deal with many of the challenges that we're facing, both in terms of how do we redistribute the impacts and costs of climate change to those that are vulnerable and in need of adaptation. How do we do this in an efficient manner? Well, we have a very elegant and simple solution, but yeah, it becomes complicated in the implementation at individual country levels and in the case where you have other actors.
I think we won't have time on this episode, but I would love to explore what are the pathways to that. I think that's probably one of the things we're doing with this podcast is we're sort of going on an adventure, searching and asking people for the answers or why they think the blocks and solutions are. And so that definitely feels like, let's hold this thought, let's get together and figure out where that might flow or where we might find flow with that. And I guess also it links as well to nature. I think it feels like we have never accurately priced anything. If we think about the true cost of receiving whatever that might be, and where are we at with pricing in nature into, for example, our commerce or our industry?
Really early stage. Climate has a very envious ability to take a commodity that is fundamentally identical and transferable all around the world, and that is carbon. And even for other gases, convert them into carbon dioxide by relatively well understood scientific conversions. When it comes to nature, you suddenly have a whole range of different measures and metrics to consider. You have also a large degree of local relevance. If I tell you rainfall is going to be 10 centimeters less where you live, that might be no difference at all to productivity and growth. But in another place, that might be catastrophic to livelihoods of people. So we don't necessarily have the same level of that. And that's why I think many of these implementations begin locally, but it's things that are kind of those big hitting and cross-cutting elements, things like deforestation, things like biodiversity collapse, that I think we come to them so often because this problem is so challenging to think about in a holistic sense. If we want to talk about all of the different types of pollutants in different regions and their differentiated effects on species, on agricultural productivity, on overall economic value, these are harder questions. And that's why I think having a rough sense both of risk and responsibility is what's so important. It's the work that the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures is trying to set out. But I think it is nothing but a very ambitious project to do.
What are some of the risks and rewards of us looking closer at that and acting with more intention collectively around this area?
Well, I think the risks are that we make poor decisions based on either incomplete assessments of our nature and its valuation, or we make decisions that, again, as we were talking about earlier, are too market driven and don't think about some of these public good effects, some of these elements that maybe aren't as easily quantifiable. And that old absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence is a little bit true here when it comes to this case of just because there may not be an immediate single stakeholder return for an element of nature doesn't mean it can be like a Jenga piece simply extracted from the tower of ecosystem services without causing other effects. And so I think we're definitely likely to land on the low side in our estimates, maybe not globally, but certainly in individual considerations of nature evaluation. The second thing on the opportunities is I think we can begin to see ways to create incentives and also create structures that make preservation not only a more desirable outcome, but also one that benefits local communities. We've seen this with success in the conservation space in places that have worked with local communities, both on maintaining forests, but also on maintaining endangered species. And when local communities are engaged and involved in that, I think you see a lot of those benefits and you see that resulting in better outcomes.
That feels really true and actually brings us in full circle to the way that you opened, which was when we consider the factors of nature, climate, and all people in the same sort of way of solving these challenges is when we get the best solutions. And I would add as well, I feel like we're still yet to fully embody both individually and collectively that we are nature and that we are part of the ecosystem. We've done so much to distance ourselves and disconnect ourselves from that connection to what you mentioned as a web of interconnectivity, perhaps with nature, with all beings. And I feel through a variety of different things, we've whether it was perhaps initially the way that our religious structures brought that distance, or whether it then became the way capitalism brought that distance, or even now when we talk about nature as perhaps being separate from us, and actually we are nature. And I feel only when we embody that within all of us, and we feel and care in that way, it's that transition I feel that will have as much power as any of these individual actions that we take. So I'm really grateful for your time today. Thank you. And thank you for sharing your insight and knowledge. I would love to welcome listeners of this to join us. This is a co-creation. So, and yourself as well, David, these are many touch points from which we can build knowledge on together. So I feel like if I'd listed them all down, I maybe would have 10, 20 different points where I was like, what about this? But what about this? But have we got a list of this? Like, what are the key things in this space? So my invitation is for us all to build on this knowledge, to share that in a succinct way and to welcome more people to co-create with us in that. So you're welcome to follow the links in the description, and I look forward to welcoming you to co-create that with us the next time. And David, I'd love to keep building this with you. Perhaps we can revisit some of these topics in a future one. And thank you for your insight and for your perspective. It's valued and appreciated.
Thank you, Carl. It's been a pleasure talking with you, and really looking forward to seeing some of the future adventures that you go on.
Yeah, me too. Nice. Thanks, buddy.
Cool, you got it.
Please like, rate, and share this widely on your social channels. The more people that we can welcome to join us on the journey and support the change makers we champion, the faster we can combat climate change, battle biodiversity loss, and co-create a future we can all love. Where do we go next? What questions did this spark for you? Would you like to know more about a particular topic? Who shall we adventure to? What shall we ask them? Where shall we go? What shall we build? How shall we do this together? Do you have any questions or comments? Join the Future Planet community of action at futureplanet.love to sign in, sign up, and get involved. Together, we can.